In the 1970s, Australian film was revived after decades of practically no industry at all. Government support gave filmmakers the opportunity to make Australian films. It was like a flood compared to the last 40 years. It was Australia's new wave. There was sexploitation, biker films, horror, and even kung fu. Many of them were made in Melbourne. Over the last year, I have sought out many of the locations of these films. Movies from the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
She likes me.
But what about before 1970? Were any of them shot in Melbourne? We started out strong. In 1906, The Story of the Kelly Gang was released. It ran for more than an hour. Possibly the longest narrative film yet seen in the world. Only 17 minutes of it survives. It was shot in Heidelberg on an estate which has now become this. Australia's film industry continued to thrive throughout the 1920s and 30s. These films were mainly set in the outback or the country. I went on a search for movies that were made in Melbourne back in the old days. In 1910, a short film directed by Charles Cozen Spencer was Queen City of the South. It was shot just after the newly constructed Flinders Street station opening. The only other films I could find made in Melbourne were His Royal Highness, which was Australia's first musical. It was filmed at His Majesty's Theatre on Exhibition Street and was released in 1932.
Everybody go on, buzz off, off it. It is His Majesty's wish that the court disperse.
In 1936, the film Thoroughbred was released, filmed at Flemington Racecourse. Charles Chauvel seemed to be our most notable director in the 30s and 40s, giving Errol Flynn his first screen appearance in the Wake of the Bounty. He also launched the career of Chips Rafferty, and his final film was Australia's first in colour, Jeddah, shot in the Northern Territory in 1955. Once the 1950s was upon us, most films that were made in Australia were made by foreign filmmakers, from America or England. There was Smiley and Smiley Gets a Gun, which was a co-American British production, shot on an estate at Camden Park and Grundy, New South Wales.
What's that dreadful little larrikin been up to now?
The only film that I could find shot in Melbourne was On the Beach, which was made by an American director, Stanley Kramer, with mostly Hollywood actors. And things weren't getting much better in the 1960s. The only two Australian films that I've ever heard of that were made in that decade were They're a Weird Mob, which was a British production filmed in Sydney,
Bring out the bloody beer!
and Age of Consent, which was also a British production, was shot in Queensland's Great Barrier Reef, starring imported movie star James Mason, portraying an Australian artist.
We haven't taken a look at the dunny.
But surely there were films made in Melbourne in the 1960s. Well, there were. And some of them by the same director. It's possible you've never heard of Giorgio Mangiamele. Most books written about Australian cinema don't mention Giorgio. But he is a very important part of our cinema history. In 1965, Giorgio became the third Australian film director to have a feature film accepted into competition in the Cannes Film Festival, a movie which he had to mortgage his house to make. He immigrated to Australia in 1952 and in less than a year was making his own feature film. With experience in photography, Giorgio set up and ran a successful photographic business on Rathdown Street, Carlton North. And many of the films that he made later on would be shot in Carlton. His first film was called Il Contratto, which in English translates to The Contract. The film is about 4 Italian immigrants who arrive in Australia expecting to work on a government contract, only to find that work never materialises. The men must find work and build a life in Melbourne. The interesting thing about Il Contratto is that it wasn't completed. It was shot and edited together and runs for about 90 minutes, but there's no sound. It was intended that sound and dialogue would be added later, like most of Giorgio's films, but This never happened, and all we have of Il Contratto is a silent film. Giorgio wrote, directed and acted in this film at a time when the film industry in Australia was dead, and almost all film production was self-funded. And there are plenty of locations throughout Melbourne where Giorgio shot his films. Behind me is Lygon Street. It's very European in nature, particularly Italian. Many Italians came here in the 40s and 50s and set up cafes and restaurants. And I have a feeling that some of Il Contratto was filmed on this street. The challenges that face migrants would be a common theme throughout Mangiamele's films. Il Contratto is an extraordinary independent production for its time, despite the fact that it's incomplete. It narrates the difficulties and the resulting anguish and frustration faced by these men who migrate to Australia. But against all odds, they're able to overcome their struggles and find a better life. In 1962, Giorgio released a short film called The Spag. There is also an unreleased version with an identical plot, but a different lead character. Both are targeted discrimination. The unreleased version is about an Italian migrant who has to deal with racist co-workers, a racist landlady, racist woman standing out the front of his house, and a racist child. It was filmed in and around the corner of Queensberry Street and Drummond Street, Carlton. These films present a powerful visualisation of migrant alienation and a confronting portrayal of the way they were treated by society.
Only because he couldn't speak your own language. Yes, he had much to live for, like every human being.
The release version of The Spag gave us roughly the same plot, but with a young migrant boy as the main character. And that was shot around Giorgio's studio in Rathdown Street, Carlton North. 99% was released in 1963. It's about the plight of an Italian widower by the name of Pino and his young school-aged son Peter. The two struggle with the absence of a woman in the house, so the father decides to order a wife through a shifty agency who promises a beautiful blonde wife for him. Giorgio's aim was to make art films, and his artistic style put the visual image ahead of anything else. Pino is humiliated by his mail-order bride and walks back through Curtin Square Park, where he sits down to recover. Images projecting humiliation, disappointment and hope were perfectly captured by Mangiamele. 99% received an honourable mention at the Australian Film Institute Awards in 1963. The film begins and ends with a drunk man antagonising Pino in the street before continuing to stagger around the laneways of Carlton North. 99% is the only comedy Mangiamele made. It also deals with the plight of migrants living in Australia and the gender imbalance that faced Italian men in those days. It's a charming, funny, endearing film that's an absolute pleasure to watch. The film that took Mangiamele to the Cannes Film Festival in 1965 was Clay. Filmed mostly at Montsalvat, an art colony in Eltham. Quite a beautiful place that's still there today. The film is about A woman and her father are driving back home and they discover a man lying on the side of the road. Now this man is an escaped criminal, so we don't know what he's done, but he's running pretty fast from the police. And now he ends up on the side of the road, and the woman Margot and her father stop and pretty much take him in. The man's name is Nick. So they bring Nick back here and look after him. Margot falls deeply in love with him, and pretty much from the word go, Nick is putting the moves on Margot, much to the disdain of Chris, who is another man that lives here.
I'm going to marry you, Margot. I hate seeing this tramp hanging around you all the time.
It's not clear whether he's her boyfriend or they were in a relationship or he thinks that she's his girlfriend. I don't know, it's not really clear, but he is enraged by the presence of this man and is jealous as hell and does everything he can to convince Nick to leave.
Everything seems so unreal now. Perhaps it's a dream. Perhaps... what?
The scene with the bunch of sticks that almost hit Nick was here. Nick is helping Chris with some, they're bundling up sticks and they're bringing them up there, and one of the bunch of sticks, the rope snaps.
Nick, watch out!
The sticks come down, almost hurting Nick. I can't imagine it would have killed him, but Chris just stands up there with the rope, holding it like, you know, it's not my fault, it's the rope. Nick washes his face under this tap here. He leans down, he puts his face in there, and no, I'm not going to do it. This is the seat where Nick and Margot sit and play a mind-reading game. Something that Margot says she played when she was a little girl.
What's this?
It's a game I used to play when I was a little girl. Shut your eyes and think of something as hard as you can.
Oh, that's enough laughing.
If you follow this road for 3 miles, it'll take you to the station.
Chris is so desperate to get rid of Nick that he actually
Open it.
offers Nick, you know, a bag of cash. Apparently it's his life savings, and Nick refuses and says, "No, Chris literally takes the money. He's throwing it all over the place. Take my money! Take my money!
Take it!
Crazy.
When they kill a bird, no one stops to think that life, any life, is something you're given once.
Chris and Nick get into a lot of heated exchanges. They actually have a punch-up scene where Nick pretty much beats the hell out of Chris, and he physically picks him up off the ground and takes him outside and throws him onto the ground. Pretty brutal. But
I can't stay here. I'm hurting you all.
He's gone mad. He wanted to kill you.
He loves you!
I never loved him.
Play's actually, it's a really good film. It should be more well known than it is. Despite its screening at Cannes, Clay had a pretty hostile reception back in Australia, particularly at the Sydney Film Festival, where it was agreed to be the most visually stunning film but fell short in regards to the dialogue.
Take it slowly.
It was screened on the ABC a year later, only to be cut so it would fit into a 1-hour time slot. Clay was almost never seen again in its entirety until its DVD release in 2011. Giorgio was not part of the 1970s new wave and only made one more film, Beyond Reason, in 1970. He later travelled to Papua New Guinea to make a series of educational films and also teaching the locals filmmaking. In David Stratton's great documentary series on Australian cinema, he makes no mention of Giorgio. If Stratton did, he would have included him in episode 2, which was titled Outsiders, because Giorgio was an outsider, making films when practically no one did, and art house films at that. Giorgio's legacy is frequently overlooked. At a time when most Australians believed they could only be viewers of cinema, Giorgio showed them that they could make their own films. Giorgio seemed to care more about the art form rather than what's popular and familiar. So when I think of our film pioneers, of course I think of Charles Chauvel. But also, I think of Giorgio Mangiamele.